Hey everyone, my name's Deanna and I am obsessed with startups and the amazing things that go on behind the scenes to make them successful. In today's episode of Studio Upstart, we're going to take a look at the creation process of startup studios and what happens when an idea takes off. Now, I advise startup studios as part of my job, and I get a lot of questions from passionate entrepreneurs who are interested in the startup studio model. This is the episode to watch. This is the video to watch if you're an entrepreneur with a ton of ideas. Now, there are a variety of founders out there, obviously, and some have one brilliant idea for one specific startup that could revolutionize and disrupt one particular industry. But other founders have a ton of ideas and don't want to choose just one. Founding a company is a long-term thing. Very few innovation teams can start, launch, and exit a startup in under 5 years. It takes at least a year to find product market fit, another year to scale the venture to a point at which it's interesting enough for another company to want to acquire it, or threatening enough for another business to want to buy the startup to get rid of the competition. The startup studio model is for those entrepreneurs who are creative, curious, and a little bit impatient in the best way. As you'll learn from this video, startup studios allow founders to work on multiple ideas at once. You'll also learn what happens after a venture proves viable as part of the startup studio system. And the best part about startup studios is that you and your team get to go through the fun part of creating the startup, but don't have to run the startup indefinitely. I know you're excited to learn how this works, so let's jump in. Okay, so let's imagine a scenario in which you are an entrepreneur with a ton of ideas. You probably start a bunch of projects that never get finished because you're on to the next one pretty fast. Let me tell you something, this is not a flaw. You are not unfocused, you're not scattered, you just see the world differently than everybody else, and your passion isn't limited to just one type of disruption. The whole world is trying to put you in a box and tell you to stay there, but I know you have other plans. And let me be the first to tell you that you are amazing because of that, not despite it.
The first thing you should do is find other people like you. I know it's hard, but you might just be looking in the wrong places. Chances are good that your roommate isn't the person you should go into business with. Neither is your quirky work colleague or your old college buddy. To find people who think the way you do about entrepreneurship, you have to put the effort into searching. I recommend you check out entrepreneur-focused meetups, browse through the networking app Shaper, look on LinkedIn, and use Twitter to your advantage. Try looking under hashtags such as Startup Studio, Venture Builder, Entrepreneur, and Startups. I also recommend reading articles on Medium. Most of the time, the people writing articles on entrepreneurship are solo entrepreneurs looking to spread their ideas. Comment on their work and see if you can build a connection.
Okay, so once you've found 3 to 4 other entrepreneurs who share your vision, you're ready to move on to the next phase of the plan. Startup studios need funding in order to work. Sometimes startup studios are founded by successful entrepreneurs who've sold companies in the past and have the capital to take on this bold new adventure, but most often startup studios are funded with venture capital dollars. And there are a number of reasons why VCs are incentivized to invest specifically in startup studios. For one, investing in startup studios lowers the risk for investors because they know the core team. When investors put money into a new startup, they're taking a bet on an otherwise unproven team. The VC firm will obviously do its best to de-risk their investment by conducting good and thorough due diligence, but there's nothing they can do about it if the founding team falls apart. With startup studios, they get the benefit of working with the same founding team over and over and over again, so their investment is way less risky. Secondly, investors know that economies of scale kick in when the studio begins reusing resources to create new startups. This is especially true when the team is focused on one specific industry. Unlike a brand new startup team who would have to purchase new equipment, forge new partnerships, and learn everything for the first time, a startup studio team is able to reuse their equipment, tap into their existing connections, and draw upon the knowledge they've already gathered to build new adventures at a super accelerated pace. This increased speed to market works to increase the probability of success. And obviously, investors benefit from that because the first to market is most often the winner. It is safe to say that if an investor is interested in funding an early stage startup, they'll be extra interested in funding a startup studio just the same. So far, we have covered step 1 and step 2. Once your team has found some funding, you're ready to move on to step 3, the idea. In the 4th episode of Studio Upstart, called How Do Startup Studios Differentiate Themselves?, I compared the inner workings of a few different startup studios. From that video, we learned that the startup studio called Rocket Internet only really takes ideas from the inside their studio, which is totally different from the model of another studio called Science Inc. This venture builder takes ideas from external founders, meaning they allow people to submit their ideas to the studio even though these entrepreneurs are not employed by or in an existing partnership with the studio. I bring up these 2 examples to show you that when it comes to step 3, you have some options. You and your team may decide to bring in outside ideas or keep everything in-house. Regardless of which you choose, you need to collectively decide on a niche and industry vertical to start with. You should choose something that you're all passionate about and something that has a lot of potential for disruption. You can always change your focus later if it seems like you didn't choose one that's working, but you really do need to start with some theme in mind. After the idea has been chosen, you're well on your way to launching your studio. The next step is to assign 2 to 3 members of the studio staff to each project. Remember that with a startup studio, your team should be working on multiple ideas at the same time. The most important thing to remember here is that only 2 to 3 entrepreneurs from the internal core team should be assigned to each project at any given time. It's a bad idea to have every member of the team working on every startup venture because it's overwhelming and it's not efficient. Step number 5 is the execution of the idea. Now, as mentioned, only the people best suited for the particular project should be assigned to develop the venture, and the studio should give the rest of the team weekly updates about the progress and any issues they're running into and creating the startup. It's worth noting that killing an idea because it isn't working or there's no market for it should be a full team decision, but the entrepreneurs who've worked directly on the project should have a very heavy influence on that decision. Step number 6 is all about testing. If the venture looks like it's going to work, now is the time to gain real-time proof of demand. This means the studio team should introduce their MVP to the market and try to generate sales, email lists, pre-orders, or whichever is appropriate to the type of venture at hand. This is where data collection happens, and as a result, the whole studio team should evaluate the startup metrics to give it the green light to move from idea to serious venture. Step 7 closely follows step 6 because testing and finding traction go hand in hand. If the venture gains popularity and becomes a serious standalone venture, a new outside team needs to be recruited to take on the startup and run it through exit. So this is the point where I find most often entrepreneurs are getting confused. They'll ask me, why would I give my startup away when we just spent all this time building it from the ground up? And my answer is always, so you can start building another startup venture from the ground up. I want to be very clear here. Startup studios are startup creation entities. Keyword being creation. You and your studio team will ideate, fund, test, and validate, find traction for your startup venture, but then it's out of your hands. You recruit a new team of capable founders to come in and you transition the startup over to that team so your team can get back to the drawing board and develop another kick-ass company. I have personally seen the failure of some startup studios that have tried to run the startups they just created themselves. It's inefficient, it's expensive, it's exhausting. Look, you're the brains behind your startup works of art. You let a new team handle the scale, the growth, the exit stuff. And don't think though that you're doing all this for nothing. The core team, your team that just created the startup in the first place, typically will keep 40 to 50% of the equity in the startup. And your investment partners, the VCs who funded your studio, will likely take 10% of the remaining equity from that startup. Meaning that, yes, the new startup founding team is essentially being handed a fantastic new business, but they're only getting roughly 40% equity in the venture among all of them. So, when an exit event happens, you, your team, your investors, you'll all be rewarded just the same as the new team. This is what I call the Startup Studio Spinout Timeline. It begins with the original team recruiting the new team to come take over running the startup. Next, the venture is gradually transitioned away from the studio and into the hands of the new team. At some point, which I call independence, the new team will take over the new startup company and run it without the help of the studio. I should note that it's best to keep the lines of communication open here. If the new team has a question or runs into an issue, they should feel confident in being able to call to your team to get help. Step 4 of the takeover involves the actual execution events of running the startup. The new team should figure out how to make the real product from your MVP and continue to refine it as they launch. This phase can take anywhere from 3 to 4 years because the new team needs to scale the venture and capture a percentage of the market. Last but not least, the new team should aim for an exit. When the venture is big enough, the new team should be looking for opportunities to get the startup acquired, merge it with an existing company, or sell it to a competitor. It's important that the new team understand this piece of the puzzle. Startup studios make money where there is an exit event. Investors get paid back when there is an exit event. The new team must have an exit event in the long-term plan for the startup studio model to make sense. So that's it. You find a group of entrepreneurs to go into business with, you get funding, you pick an industry, you start working on ideas, you move the idea through a testing and traction phase, you transition the startup to a new team, while your team heads back to the drawing board to create your next venture. The new team finds product market fit and then scales it to traction and exit, and then in 3 to 5 years, an exit event will happen and everybody gets paid. Obviously, the details at a high level are a bit more complicated than that, but honestly, that's like the entire process for launching and running and exiting successful startups through a startup studio model. If you think this model sounds awesome, you would be really smart to get involved now. Last year, in 2019, there were just under 80 startup studios worldwide, but now there are an estimated 300. The market is growing like crazy, and the early adopters will definitely come out on top. Because the industry is so new, we're only just now beginning to see what success looks like with these venture builders. But with companies like Dollar Shave Club, Giphy, Vitabox, Reserve, and more coming out of startup studios, we can safely say that startup studios are the innovation vehicle of the future. Okay, so that's it for me today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Studio Upstart, and if you learned something today, please hit the subscribe button and tap the bell to get notified when I release the next video in this series. Thanks so much for watching. I am Deanna. This is Studio Upstart. Have a great day.